The night before Abigail Carter's wedding was supposed to be the most magical night of her entire life. She had been planning this moment for nearly a year. The flowers, the dress, the vows she had quietly rehearsed in her bathroom mirror every single morning for weeks. And for one brief, beautiful evening, it felt like everything was finally falling into place. The people she loved most were gathered in one room. There was music. There was laughter. There was the kind of warmth that only comes when a family truly comes together. But before that night ended, something happened behind a closed bathroom door that would shatter Abigail's world completely. And the person responsible? It was not a stranger. It was not someone from the outside. It was someone sitting right there in that room. Someone holding a glass of champagne. Someone who had smiled at her that same night and told her she was going to make a wonderful addition to the family. What happened to Abigail is the kind of story that most people never want to believe is real, but it is. And tonight, we are going to talk about it.
Before we continue, I want to know where you're watching from right now. Drop your country in the comments below. We have viewers joining from all over the world, and it means everything to know you're here. And if you care about stories that bring real awareness to the kind of abuse that hides behind closed doors and family smiles, make sure you hit the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Because these stories is more common than most people think, and the more we talk about it, the harder it becomes for it to stay hidden.
Abigail Carter was 28 years old, and by almost every measure, she was the kind of person who made the people around her feel safe. She had grown up in a mid-sized town in the American Midwest, the kind of place where neighbors still brought casseroles when someone was sick, where the high school football game was the biggest event of the fall, and where everybody, at some point or another, knew everybody else's business. She had grown up in that town, gone to college 2 states away on a partial scholarship, studied education, and come back home to teach 2nd grade at the same elementary school she had attended as a little girl. She was, as her colleagues often described her, one of those rare people who seemed to carry a kind of quiet goodness in everything she did. She remembered birthdays. She checked in on friends who had gone quiet. She kept a jar of wildflowers on her classroom windowsill because she said every child deserved to see something beautiful when they walked in on a Monday morning. She had met her fiancé, Ryan Holt, almost 4 years before the wedding. They had been introduced through mutual friends at a small backyard gathering, and according to people who were there that evening, the two had talked for almost 3 hours straight before anyone else even noticed they had pulled away from the group. Ryan was kind. He was steady. He was the kind of man who opened doors and remembered how people took their coffee. Abigail had fallen for him slowly, the way most real things tend to grow, not in a single dramatic moment, but over months of quiet dinners, late-night phone calls, and long drives with no particular destination. By the time Ryan proposed, Abigail had no doubt in her mind. She said yes before he had even finished asking the question. And she spent the next 11 months doing what women who truly love the idea of a life together tend to do. She poured herself into every detail of the wedding. She chose the venue herself, a converted barn on the east side of the county, with wooden beams and string lights and a wraparound porch where she imagined her grandmother would sit and watch the sunset. She picked the flowers. She tasted the cake 3 times because the first 2 rounds were not quite right. She had written and rewritten her vows so many times that the pages were soft from folding. The night before the wedding was supposed to be a small, intimate gathering, nothing lavish, just family, close friends, and a chance to breathe before the biggest day of her life. Ryan's father, Raymond Holt, was 61 years old, and if you had asked anyone in town to describe him, most people would have reached first for the word successful. He ran a commercial real estate development firm that had been in the Holt family for 2 generations. He drove a silver Mercedes. He sat on the board of 2 local nonprofits. He had the kind of firm handshake and direct eye contact that made people feel, in the moment, as though they were the most important person in the room. He was, on the surface, exactly the kind of father-in-law a young woman could be proud to have. He was polished. He was influential. He was the kind of man who got tables at restaurants without reservations and who people greeted by name when he walked into a room. But there were people, a smaller, quieter group, who knew Raymond Holt differently. A former business partner had once described him, in a conversation that was never meant to leave the room, as a man who believed that the rules that applied to other people simply did not apply to him. There were whispers, the kind that tend to stay below the surface in close communities where reputation is currency. A woman at his firm had quietly resigned 3 years earlier under circumstances that were never fully explained. A neighbor who had worked on a charity gala with him had once told a friend that Raymond made her deeply uncomfortable, though she could never quite put into words why. These were the kinds of stories that never made it to a police report. They lived in careful silences, in loaded glances across a room, in the careful way certain women stepped slightly back when Raymond entered a conversation. Ryan had grown up watching his father command every room he entered. He had learned to admire the confidence, the authority, the ease with which Raymond moved through the world. He had never had reason to question it. Abigail, for her part, had always found Raymond charming, if a little intense. There were moments, brief, easy to dismiss, where she had felt his attention linger slightly too long, a compliment that went 1 degree past comfortable, a touch on the arm during a family dinner that lasted a beat more than it should have. But she had always pushed those feelings aside. She told herself she was imagining things, that she was nervous about being accepted, that it was simply the way some older men were, a generational thing, nothing more. She had no way of knowing that those instincts were right.
The gathering was held at the Holt family home, a large, beautifully maintained colonial on the north side of town, with a landscaped backyard, a wide covered patio, and a kitchen that had been designed for entertaining. Ryan's mother, Carol Holt, had organized most of it. She had ordered catering from a local restaurant, arranged flowers in glass vases on the dining table, and put together a playlist that moved between soft jazz and Abigail's favorite Spotify station. There were maybe 20 people in total. Abigail's parents were there, her mother, Sandra Carter, a retired nurse with kind eyes and a nervous laugh, and her father, Gerald Carter, a man who had cried 3 separate times during the rehearsal earlier that evening and was doing his best to hold it together now. Abigail's 2 closest friends, women she had known since middle school, were there as well, flushed with excitement and slightly giddy from the glass of Prosecco they'd had before even arriving.
Ryan was in and out of conversations all evening, glowing in the way people do when everything they have hoped for is about to become real. He kept finding Abigail across the room and catching her eye, and every time he did, she felt that same warmth she had felt in that backyard 4 years ago. For the first 2 hours, it was everything a night before a wedding should be. Abigail ate. She laughed. She listened to her father tell the same embarrassing story about her childhood that he had told at every major milestone of her life. She danced, just briefly, in the kitchen with her best friend while Carol pretended not to see. And she thought, more than once, that she was the luckiest woman alive. Raymond had been drinking since before the guests arrived. Not in a way that was immediately obvious. Raymond Holt was the kind of man who carried alcohol well, who grew louder and looser with each drink, but maintained just enough control to avoid appearing sloppy. But by 9 o'clock that evening, the people who knew him well could see the shift. His laugh came a little faster. His jokes landed a little harder than the room required. He refilled his glass more often than he ate from his plate. He had always been attentive toward Abigail in a way that occupied a thin, uncomfortable line between warmth and something harder to name. But that night, in a room full of people celebrating her future, his attention toward her was different. He made a point of finding her in every conversation. He brought her a fresh drink she had not asked for. At one point, standing near the fireplace, he placed a hand on her lower back while telling a story to a group of people, and left it there for just long enough that Abigail shifted her body slightly to the side to move away from it. She caught the eye of her friend across the room and gave a small, tight smile that did not reach her eyes. She was not sure what she was feeling. She did not have a word for it yet. But somewhere deep in her chest, something quiet and certain was beginning to warn her. At first, Abigail told herself she was imagining things. This was Ryan's father. This was the man who would give the toast at her wedding in fewer than 24 hours. This was family. She pushed the feeling down, the way she had learned to do, the way so many women learn to do. and went back to her guests. At some point, just before 10 o'clock, Abigail excused herself from a conversation near the kitchen and slipped down the hallway toward the bathroom. The noise of the party faded behind her as she turned the corner. The laughter, the music, the clink of glasses, and for just a moment, in the quiet of the hallway, she felt a wave of peace. She was getting married tomorrow. Everything was perfect. She opened the bathroom door, stepped inside, and had barely closed it behind her when she heard footsteps in the hallway. She did not think much of it. Bathrooms at parties were always in demand. But then the footsteps stopped directly outside the door. And then there was a knock. She said she was inside. The door opened anyway. Raymond stepped into the bathroom and closed the door behind him. What happened in the next few minutes, Abigail would later describe in careful, measured words that never fully captured what it felt like to live through them.
He was drunk. He was close. He said things she did not expect, things that made no sense coming from the man who was supposed to become her family. And when she tried to move past him, he blocked the doorway. She said his name. He did not respond the way a man should respond when a woman says his name in that tone. She said it again. When Abigail finally got out of that bathroom, she was shaking. The hallway was empty. The party was still going in the other room. She could hear Ryan laughing at something someone had said. She stood in that hallway for a long moment, back pressed against the wall, the sound of her own breathing the loudest thing she could hear. And she did not go back to the party right away. She stood there and tried to understand what had just happened to her, in the home of the man she was about to marry into, less than 12 hours before her wedding, with every person she loved sitting 20 feet away. The details of exactly what Raymond said and did in that bathroom would eventually be documented. But the most important detail, the one that mattered most, was the look on Abigail's face when she finally walked back into that room. Her friend saw it immediately.
Abigail spent the rest of that evening in a state that can only be described as controlled survival. She smiled when someone smiled at her. She answered questions. She hugged Ryan before he left for the night. She thanked Carol for a beautiful evening. She said all the right things in all the right order, the way people do when their mind has shut down around a single, unbearable reality, and their body is simply running on muscle memory. Her friend, the one who had caught her eye across the room earlier, drove her home that night. They had known each other since they were 11 years old, and she could tell immediately that something was wrong. She waited until they were alone in Abigail's apartment before she asked.
And when she did, Abigail sat down at her kitchen table, folded her hands in her lap, and stared at the floor for a long time before she spoke. "I think something just happened," she said, "and I don't know what to do." She laid out what had occurred in that bathroom in quiet, precise sentences. Her friend listened without interrupting. When Abigail finished, the room was completely silent. Outside, through the kitchen window, the town was still and dark and completely unaware. And inside that apartment, two women sat with the weight of a truth that could not be undone. Because tomorrow was supposed to be the beginning of the rest of Abigail's life. And now, everything that had felt certain that morning felt like something she was no longer sure about at all. Think about that for a moment. Think about what it would feel like to be sitting in your own home the night before your wedding, having just survived something you never saw coming, and knowing that the person who did it would be standing at the front of the church the very next morning. Can you imagine carrying that? Can you imagine how alone she must have felt in that moment? I want you to really sit with that. Before we go further, stories like Abigail's remind us how abuse of power can happen in the places and moments we least expect. If you believe stories like this deserve to be heard, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear it. Your support helps bring awareness to situations that far too many people are afraid to talk about. And if you haven't already, please subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss our upcoming stories. Now let us continue. Abigail did not sleep that night. She lay in her bed with her wedding dress hanging on the back of her closet door and stared at the ceiling while her mind worked through every possible version of what came next.
If she told Ryan, what would happen? Ryan adored his father. He had spent a lifetime looking up to him, measuring himself against him, building the kind of bond between a son and his father that does not bend easily. Would he believe her? She wanted to believe he would.
But she also knew what it meant to accuse a man like Raymond Holt of something like this. She knew what Raymond's reputation in that town was worth. She knew how many people would line up to say that this was impossible, that Raymond would never, that Abigail must have misunderstood, that perhaps she had been drinking herself, that maybe she was nervous about the wedding and her mind was playing tricks. These were the words she was already preparing herself to hear, and they had not even been spoken yet. She thought about the guests who were already traveling, relatives who had flown in from out of state, old friends who had booked hotels, her grandmother who had bought a new dress for the occasion.
She thought about her parents and how her father had cried 3 times at the rehearsal and how he would look walking her down the aisle tomorrow. She thought about all of it, and she pressed her face into her pillow and tried to find a version of the next 12 hours that made sense. There was not one. Speaking out could destroy everything. Staying silent could destroy her. These are the choices that survivors of abuse are so often forced to make, not between easy and hard, but between 2 kinds of impossible. And the cruelty of it is not just what happened. The cruelty is the silence that comes after, the calculation, the weighing of your own truth against every other thing you love. No one should ever have to make that decision. Not the night before their wedding. Not ever.
By the time morning came, Abigail had made a decision, not to stay silent, but not to let the morning swallow her whole either. She called her friend before sunrise. They spoke for a long time, and by the time the sun had fully risen over the town, 2 things were true simultaneously. Abigail was going to get married, and she was going to tell Ryan the truth. She asked her friend to be with her when she did it. They drove together to the hotel where Ryan and his groomsmen had stayed the night, and Abigail texted Ryan to come down to the lobby alone. He came down in his dress shirt, already half dressed for the ceremony, with a wide grin on his face that faded the moment he saw her expression. They sat in 2 chairs near the lobby window with the morning light coming in, and Abigail told Ryan what his father had done. She watched his face change through every stage of it, the confusion first, then the disbelief, then something that looked like the ground falling out from underneath him. He did not say a word for a long time. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and unsteady. "Are you sure?" he asked, not in a way that was meant to deny her, but in the way that a person speaks when a truth arrives that they have no framework to hold. "Yes," she said, "I am sure." What happened in the next several hours was the kind of quiet devastation that rarely makes the headlines. There was no shouting. There was no dramatic confrontation in a church parking lot. There was a son going to his father and asking him, with his jaw clenched and his hands shaking, whether it was true. And there was Raymond Holt, polished, practiced, accustomed to the protection his reputation provided, who denied it, denied all of it, calmly, completely. The way people deny things when they have spent a lifetime being the most powerful person in every room. The wedding did not happen that day. The guests were notified by mid-morning that the ceremony was being postponed due to a family emergency. The venue was left with flowers that no one walked toward. The cake stood untouched in a refrigerator somewhere across town. Ryan's mother, Carol, who had learned what her husband was accused of from Ryan himself, sat in a chair in her living room and did not speak for 2 hours. The town, as towns tend to do, eventually found out that something had gone wrong, though the full story took time to surface, and even when it did, it came through the distorted lens of rumor and allegiance, and the particular way communities protect their most respected figures. Some people believed Abigail immediately.
Her friends, her family, the quiet group of women who had had their own experiences with Raymond that had never been spoken aloud in public. Others were not so certain. Some questioned her timing. Some suggested, without evidence, that she had a motive. Some simply could not reconcile what they were hearing with the version of Raymond Holt they had chosen to know. This is not a new story. This is what happens when a woman tells the truth about a powerful man. The truth itself becomes the thing that is put on trial. Raymond Holt did eventually face a formal investigation. The case moved slowly, the way cases involving prominent men in small communities often do. But it moved, and the women who had kept their own quiet stories about him for years began, one by one, to speak.
Abigail Carter did not disappear after that day. She did not fold into silence. She grieved, deeply, honestly, in the way that only makes sense when you have lost something you were not prepared to lose. She grieved the version of her wedding day she had planned. She grieved the family she thought she was gaining. She grieved the untouched innocence of a night that should have been full of nothing but joy. But she did not disappear. In the months that followed, she returned to her classroom. She put wildflowers on the windowsill. She leaned on the people who had always shown up for her, and she told her story. Not loudly, not performatively, but honestly, to the people who needed to hear it.
Because that is what courage looks like in real life. Not in a movie moment, not in a perfect speech, but in the quiet, steady act of refusing to let someone else's cruelty become your permanent silence. Abigail's story is one that echoes the stories of countless women who have faced a nearly identical choice between the comfort of silence and the cost of truth. Studies and advocacy organizations that work with survivors consistently report that the vast majority of assaults by people known to the victim go unreported, precisely because of the fear of not being believed, the power of the accused, and the collateral damage the truth can cause to the lives of people the victim loves. If this story moved you, if you found yourself thinking about what you would have done in Abigail's place, then it has done its job. Because awareness begins with a story. And stories like this one only reach the people who need them when people like you share them. Leave a comment below and tell me, what do you think Abigail should have done that night? Would you have had the courage to speak? And what does it say about us as a community, as a society, that women still have to calculate the cost of telling the truth? Let me know your thoughts down below.
Drop the word awareness in the comments if you believe that silence protects abusers. Let's fill the comment section. And before you go, if you're new here, click on the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. We cover stories that matters, stories that don't always make the front page, but live in the lives of real people every single day. Thank you for watching. Thank you for coming. See you in the next one.